In this section of the economics of information and choice, we move to asymmetric information, and in particular, the Lemons model. With asymmetric information, one side has more information than the other. If both sides are not equally in the dark with their imperfect information, what happens to our economic models? The classic example of this is purchasing a used car. Are all sides equally ignorant? We typically portray this as the knowledgeable used car salesman, the sleazy, greedy, knowledgeable of cars, though, used car salesman, taking advantage of the little old lady or the person who doesn't know anything about cars. Doesn't have to be the little old lady. It could be someone like me who just doesn't know much about cars. We can go, we can show up, we can kick the tires, but we don't really know much of anything about cars to actually make any knowledgeable considerations about whether we should purchase the car, whether it's going to be well run, and if it's going to work on into the future. Whereas the car salesman might know the history of the car, whether or not the engine is actually in good working condition, and other information about that car. What does economics have to say about situations of asymmetric information like this? Does having one side holding all the knowledge mean that we have something akin to market power and one side can just take advantage of those without their knowledge? We're going to look at the quintessential example of this, the used car market, for looking at asymmetric information in more detail and thinking about this problem, and in particular, the market for lemons. The market for lemons is this idea from George Akerlof's famous 1970 paper, The Market for Lemons, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. In this setup, within this model, quality is distinguishable beforehand by the seller. The seller is the knowledgeable individual, the used car salesman. The seller would love to take low-costing, low-quality cars and pass them off as high-priced, high-quality products. The buyer, however, cannot distinguish beforehand the quality. Only the average quality of the goods will be considered. So let's look at a numerical example here. There's two types of cars, and only two types of cars: high quality and low quality. Sellers value at slightly less than this, and buyers value it at slightly more than this, but we'll just kind of round it out so it's equal, so that high quality cars are worth basically $20,000 to sellers and buyers, and low quality cars are worth about $2,000 to both sellers and buyers. Buyers know that about half of the cars are high quality and about half of the cars are low quality, and the sellers know this information as well. How much are the buyers willing to pay if they can't know the quality in this numerical example? We could think about a rough kind of estimate here, a first approximation to start our thinking process by estimating the expected value, right? If half the cars are worth $20,000 and half are worth $2,000, we could do the expected value calculation of the worth of these cars. Well, if half are worth $20,000, the expected value that we would get from high quality cars would be $10,000. And if half were low quality cars, then the expected value addition that we would get would be $1,000 from the low quality cars. So we'd have $10,000 from the high and $1,000 from the low. And so if we just randomly selected a car, the average quality, the average worth would end up being about $11,000, or the expected value from this. Now, is this rough estimate or first approximation, does this make sense as what the price will actually be in this market? Is this the equilibrium price then? Well, let's look at this situation from kind of a game theoretic standpoint. We'll put this into an extensive form game and kind of see how the logic would work out. So if we put the buyer as the first player and the seller as the second player, we can think about the buyer as making the decision to say, all right, I'm going to pay the expected value, the $11,000. If the buyer pays the $11,000, then the seller gets to decide, do they sell a high quality car or a low quality car to the buyer, right? They can distinguish this quality, whereas the buyer cannot. So to do an extensive form game, we have to use backward induction, and we have to start at the end of the game. At the end of the game, we are seeing player 2 making a choice. So we only consider player 2's payoffs, and we don't consider anything else beyond this. Right? And so what we can see is the seller, well, they could sell a high quality car and lose $9,000. Why would they lose $9,000? Because if the buyer is paying $11,000 and a high quality car is worth 20 grand, well, that's a loss of $9,000. A low quality car, if the seller decides to sell the buyer a low quality car, then the seller will gain $9,000. Why? Again, the buyer, if they are paying $11,000 and the car is actually only worth $2,000, which is what a low quality car is worth in this example, then the seller gains $9,000. So the seller would gain $9,000 if they sell a low quality car. So what is the seller to do? Lose $9,000 or gain $9,000? Well, the obvious answer is that we will only see low quality cars as an option for the seller. So then we can move up the game theory through backward induction and say, okay, well, we don't even have to consider this high quality transactions here because they won't take place if we pay $11,000 for the buyer. But if the buyer says, I'd like to pay $11,000, we know that the seller will sell them a low quality car. So now what happens is we move up to stage one and think about how will the buyer act? Will the buyer pay $11,000 for this transaction, or will they just decide to stay out of the market? Now we have a choice just for player one's payoffs. So if we only consider player one's payoffs, well, the buyer, if they pay $11,000, we head down here, the seller gives them a low quality car, and the buyer gets a negative $9,000. Why? They just spent $11,000 on a low quality car, a car worth only $2,000. So they lose 9 grand. Or they could just stay out of the market and end up with 0. Well, if we just kind of think about this and we think about player one, what are they going to choose in this situation? 0 or negative 9,000, they would just pay 0. So in this situation, we start to see the logic of the market for lemons here. If we just go with an expected value as the price, then what would happen is only low quality cars would be offered by the seller, but then the buyer wouldn't purchase them. The buyer, if they offered any price above $11,000, clearly wouldn't want to make these transactions either because the seller is just going to sell the low quality cars even more so. And so we're going to have worse than negative $9,000 here. But if we go less than $11,000, then what would start to happen is we're going to get closer and closer to this being more like a reasonable option here. Closer and closer to this negative 9,000 being closer and closer to 0. And even if the buyer pays, say, $3,000, then what's going to happen is if the buyer pays $3,000, we will still get only low quality cars sold, and now we will only be at minus $1,000 for player one. And so we still wouldn't do these transactions. We're going to drive the price all the way down to the worth of these low quality cars down to $2,000. Only then will we actually get any transactions taking place, but all of the transactions that take place will only be low quality cars. We can't sell the high quality cars. We can't have anybody purchase them because the buyer won't be willing to pay and the seller won't be willing to sell at prices high enough to make that transaction take place, because if the buyer were willing to pay enough to make the seller sell it, the seller would swoop in and just sell a low quality car and get the big payoff for them. And so what ends up happening is only those low quality cars end up being sold. And so we end up with a purchase price right around, hopefully, the low quality cost of around $2,000. And we end up with a few purchases, but only purchases of low quality cars at the value of those low quality cars. So what we end up with is a market for lemons. The process is this interaction between quality heterogeneity and asymmetric information that can lead to this disappearance of the market for high quality goods. This process can continually spiral toward, and in some extreme assumption cases, it can spiral towards no sales whatsoever. But in best case situations, with this setup that we currently have, we get only used cars for sale that are lemons. So we end up with a market that is completely lemons, but everybody knows that it's a lemon. And so the transactions that take place, well, you know, they're actually okay with it, the buyers are. They know they're buying a lemon, they're paying a lemon price for it, and they're getting a lemon. The problem with the market for lemons is not that on average buyers are being ripped off or taken advantage of. On average, buyers still benefit from whatever purchases they make. The efficiency problems instead stem from the exchanges that don't happen because buyers can't distinguish good cars from bad. Right? It's the transactions that don't take place but should that are the problem. Not the transactions that are taking place but shouldn't because some knowledgeable person is ripping off the unknowledgeable individual who doesn't know anything about that market and is in the dark because of their asymmetric information. It's not the transactions that are taking place are ripoffs. It's instead the transactions that don't take place because of the asymmetric information. In the real world, everyone's not equally in the dark, right? In every situation, some people usually know more than others, and economists refer to this as asymmetric information. The efficiency problem, again, is these exchanges that don't happen because we can't have this distinguishing between the good cars and the bad from the less knowledgeable information individuals. Therefore, inefficient outcomes may be the consequence of having information that is not only imperfect, but also asymmetric. Right? It's these transactions that don't take place. Producers want these transactions to take place. Not just the consumers, everybody wants to have the high quality exchanges also take place and to have mutual gains from trade. But we can't figure it out because of the asymmetric information and the consumer being in the dark. So producers are harmed as well. They're not just ripping off the unknowledgeable consumer. Thus, there can be a big incentive for overcoming the asymmetric information or lemons problem. Today's market failure might lead to tomorrow's market solution. Consider the market for lemons. There is a really thriving used car market for used cars that we wouldn't say are all lemons. Why? Well, we've come up with solutions for overcoming the market failure caused by the asymmetric information. These solutions are handsomely rewarded and even sought out by those who have the knowledge, the producers, the people trying to sell the used cars, and not just those without the knowledge. A seller who is in a situation of more knowledge within the asymmetric knowledge situation, they may try and reduce the asymmetry themselves by putting up something like having Carfax be there and saying, hey, here's the history of these cars. Maybe having this trusted third party check the cars to ensure their quality. Firms lose with the lemons problem. They're not just taking advantage of those without knowledge. Or maybe a firm can convince others that when it says it's high quality, it actually is by reputation, by setting up shop with a big building and having advertising and having a national reputation for saying, hey, this is not a lemon. And therefore, if they say it's not a lemon, they're going to pay dearly if your car is actually a lemon because it's a hit to their reputation because you can go online and spread this information with your friends and family and try and report these issues and all this kind of stuff. Used car markets do not exist on the side of some abandoned road in northern Saskatchewan in the middle of just nowhere where, hey, you come and they say, oh yes, it's a high quality car. And then they rip you off and it's really a lemon and it's like they just, pick up shop and move somewhere else. A lot of times what we get is situations where we have like a superstore, like a CarMax or a big used car situation that tries to overcome these asymmetric information problems by having institutions that mitigate the lack of information. So is the lemons problem a good model of the real world? Sure it is, but we want to think about also what the lemons model allows us to do in thinking about the market as a process of overcoming potential information asymmetries or failures. How can we model or discuss this overcoming of the lemons model problems within standard economic theory? We really can't very well. We have to think a bit more outside the box and think a little bit more about the market as a process, a dynamic process instead. We can think of it in a game theoretic situation And instead of using game theory as outside in or inside out, such as is discussed in Richard Wagner's Mind, Society, and Human Action, we can kind of set up the world that way. Outside in game theory strategies is that we're given options and the players play within those options from the outside. They go from the outside in, right? They are given these strategies and they play from the outside, and that's the game that they're given, and they're just on the outside of that, what that game is, and they just have to play. And so they choose the options that are inside the game. And this is the kind of setup that we could have with asymmetric information where, hey, we have the lemons problem. It's a high quality car, or is it a low quality car? And we just have to make a choice, and we might only end up purchasing the low quality cars. But what if we think about the market for lemons with game theory from the inside out, where players create their options within the game and derive and change the structure of the game and change the outside options that are actually available, such as setting up things like CarMax and Carfax and other things like this. So we have to get a little bit more creative with the standard economic toolkit and do different kinds of things and think about this market as more dynamic or changeable, much more so process oriented to think about things. We can think about how the actors in Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winning economist, sense of the word, where we actually have people overcoming problems, such as Lynn Ostrom's work on the tragedy of the commons being overcome by institutional changes from within the game, changing the options itself. For more on this topic and for some great reads on this, you can look at George Akerlof's seminal paper, The Market for Lemons, Quality, Uncertainty in the Market Mechanism, 1970 QJE. You can look at Lynn Ostrom, who is mentioned at the end of this lecture, and in particular her political science presidential address called A Behavioral Approach to the Rational Choice Theory of Collective Action. And then you can also look at, as was discussed at the end of this, kind of the overcoming the lemons problem ideas at Richard Wagner's work, Mind, Society, and Human Action, and also a little short bit within Change Within Permanence. And we can get this better context of all of the informational asymmetry issues that come up, the market failures, the market process overcoming market failures, and the potential market failures that may remain. All of these are vastly interesting and important ideas for the study of economics and how we think about the market as working to meet society's needs and to meet each other's needs as we engage in exchanges.